let us still ourselves for a moment. And in this stillness, feel the wild constant of our bodies. Feel your own breath lifting and falling. Feel your own blood pulsing and pressing. Feel your own skin prickle and stretch and fold. And now let us feel our own hearts with their steady beating wisdom. And let us count the people we hold there. Notice how so easily we can simultaneously hold those who are celebrating and those who are suffering. Now let us ask for the strength to keep holding them, and ask for the vulnerability to be changed by them. And I ask this in the name of everything that is holy, and that is precisely everything. Let us breathe and be. This pulpit is so beautiful. For the last 2 years, I've had to preach off of a music stand. It's a little rickety, and you couldn't really pound on it. This is a good pulpit. Spiritual ambivalence. I applaud you for coming out to hear a sermon entitled Spiritual Ambivalence. It's not the most, well, okay, it's a provocative sermon title, and it came about because I had previously committed to writing about spirituality, and then when it came time and there was a newsletter deadline looming, and I was just feeling cranky and tired, and I was grousing to a colleague that at about that moment, I really didn't care one way or the other about spirituality. Oh, so you're experiencing spiritual ambivalence, he asked, and I said, right. And really, I'm thankful for that, because if he had said something like spiritual indifference or spiritual apathy, that sermon would have gone south real quick. So let's give thanks for spiritual ambivalence. Ambivalence. Valence. Ambivalence. Ambivalence. Valence has several different usages, and they're all rooted back to the Latin word for value. Valence, value. Ambivalence now has some antique and some contemporary uses. The ambi part of ambivalence refers to being able to go in at least two different directions. So, being ambivalent does not really mean simply not caring one way or the other about something. It's more about being able to consider the value of two different things, two different ideas. So as I talk about ambivalence, it's not to say that I don't really have an interest in something. It's that I'm willing to consider the value, the upsides, the downsides, of multiple, competing, sometimes exclusive ideas. Okay? So what am I ambivalent about? Spirituality. spirit, spiritual, eternal and everlasting spirit. Soul, soul unseen and unmeasurable. Sometimes I am even ambivalent about that spark of the divine that we say animates us and connects us. And when it comes time to consider the whole concept, I wind up ambivalent. Okay, yes. Compared to some other folks, I'm probably pretty spiritual. I mean, look at what I got into. And it seems like sometimes the spirit is a very important aspect of my life, well worth putting at the center of my attention. But other times, I just figure that my spirit probably knows what it's up to, and to just trust that it's fine and wherever it is or isn't, without trying to get my mind, my little monkey mind, micromanaging and scrutinizing and fussing over what or where or if spirit is a valid construct to work with. Because what do I mean when I'm talking about spirit? We all have heard the term, and I'm presuming that we have some shared common assumptions about what we all mean. The concept of spirit. The word, of course, is rooted out in the Latin for breath, spirit, inspired. But the concept itself still needs some unpacking. The concepts of spirit go back well before Socrates and Plato, but we're going to start with those Greeks. We're going to start with the Greeks' take on an unseen, invisible human soul and the notion of a world of eternal spirit, separate from the physical world. Plato was very explicit in his dualism. The body is of the physical world, material, finite. But the soul is on loan from an unseen spirit world to which it returns upon death to face judgment. So, according to Plato, in one person is the temporary flesh and a bit of the eternal spirit. And as he saw it, education involved coming to recognize that the spirit was superior to the flesh, and that this whole fleshy life should be spent preparing the soul for its judgment and eternal destiny. Sound familiar? Yeah? Maybe that's because Jesus, and especially his followers, picked up that construct. And they merged it with some of the Jewish theology, and they ran with it. Partly to make their own ideas easier for the average Greek to adopt. Because, thanks to Alexander the Great, common Greek was the lingua franca of the early Christian era. So if you wanted to spread the word, you did it in Greek. That's why so much of the Christian writings were in Greek. We still don't know why Marcus Aurelius was writing in Greek. Maybe to keep from people reading into his journal, I don't know. Okay, so now we have Plato's idea of spirit. Let's go look at another Greek who came along shortly after Plato, Epicurus. Epicurus took that dualistic view of humans and modified it. He took the stance that flesh and soul both ended with death. Both body and soul dissolved back into nothingness upon death. Life was for living. It wasn't just some preamble to an eternity. Right? It was this dissolving into nothingness that fit very nicely with another current theory being introduced by the philosopher Democritus, the atomic theory. Democritus was the first one who theorized that all things were made up of tiny particles that bounce around, temporarily forming and dissolving and disintegrating and then reforming things. So, when you mash together Democritus and Epicurus, you wind up with a universe where human beings are merely a chance collection of atoms destined to arrange, dissolve, and rearrange. And because human bodies and souls were temporary, Epicurus felt that reason and education should be used to live well. Lie low. Don't draw too much stress into your life. It wasn't so much that he thought you should eat dessert first. It was just that he would have recommended that you avoid politics or nasty arguments. Now, perhaps folks didn't like the idea of dissolving back into nothingness. Or perhaps the Christians really got some traction with their whole emphasis on souls and judgment. Either way, now we have a shared understanding of spirit or soul, and it is generally understood that it is this ongoing, eternal, not of this world thing. We've all heard of your everlasting soul. Right? And some of us have even picked up on the Hindu notion of a soul that is reincarnated over and over and over before finally being reunited with an eternal. But very few of us have a common shared idea of soul or spirit as something compostable. Something that might degrade and have its bits rearranged. And now Epicurus is known more for his appreciation of a good meal rather than his finite soul. You type in Epicurus, you get recipes. Why? Is it human ego or the love of the self that makes us kind of prefer the idea that some part of us will keep going on indefinitely past death? Maybe. It's just that, in any case, one version of spirit is way more popular than the other one, right? When people say that they don't really believe in souls, they're typically referring to Plato's soul, not Epicurus's. And plenty of people have rejected Plato's separate, unseen, and eternal version of soul. Because, why would a universe have two sets of books with two sets of physics? One for the material and physical, and one for this unseen, unmeasurable? Just to keep us on our toes? Just because that's the kind of confounding that prompts some of us to just quit worrying about spirit and souls or anything else that's unmeasurable. Because when you start thinking about that stuff, it's really hard to get dinner cooked. And while you're contemplating the eternal, you can wind up burning the water. It just gets easier to get like Epicurus and focus on the living of the here and the now, and live fully and well, and avoid politics and loud arguments. Just fix a nice, simple supper and eat it slowly and with appreciation for the way that the body takes in those atoms and rearranges them into energy and tenderness. Just let the soul do whatever it's going to do. But perhaps you've had a moment where you could sense the largeness and interconnectedness of all things. Maybe you've had a sense of transcendence, that which transcends time and body and even the laws of physics. Those are the moments when the Spirit seems to be saying, pay attention. And when the Spirit says, do, it's really hard to ignore that commandment. So where does that leave us? Well, if you're ambivalent or uncertain of which Greek to follow, let me assure you that's okay. All right? Our religious tradition doesn't insist on a belief in an unseen soul or eternal spirit. In our religious tradition, even when we do recognize a soul or spirit, we are not asked to make it the most important part of ourselves. We're cool with bodies here. Some of my best friends have bodies. I'm going to even offer that this ambivalence towards spirit is actually a legitimate theological response steeped in our history and deeply reflective of our values. Because if we're ambivalent on spirit, it's because we refuse to be certain. Because we know that with certainty comes complacency, and with complacency comes a certain tendency to be smug, and when it comes to the most vital details, like if we have an eternal soul or if we're simply a random collection of atoms, we would rather be uncertain and open to see new truths than to be stubbornly fixed and unresponsive. If we are ambivalent, it's because we feel that revelation is not sealed. It is ongoing. Can you see how that's such a different theology from one that tells us that everything is fixed and predetermined? I'd rather have a messy uncertainty that might bring me to something new than a certainty that will keep me pinned in place and unable to respond to change. Okay, let's wrap this up. What is my advice to the spiritually ambivalent and to those of us who are living into our uncertainty? Well, if you truly don't hold to the notion of soul or spirit, please know you have plenty of company. But I would invite you to do some honest examination of what you've thought about spirit, spirituality, soul, or anything eternal. Think about that. Figure out where you learned to think like that. Be able to clearly state what it is that you are not interested in and why. And if you've had a sense of soul, a presence of spirit, here's what I'll ask you to consider. Look at what you've known, look at what you've experienced very closely. Are you hanging on to the idea of an eternal spirit simply as an extension of the self through eternity? Is it a need for certainty or simply a comfort? Or are you willing to consider that it might follow the same laws as atoms and it might redistribute over time? What if the soul is not about the self, not about your acts or actions, but entirely about your letting go and reuniting with the all that is? What I'm asking you to consider is a totally non-self version of spirit. No ego, no personality, no person, no judgment. Quite simply, what if it is a spark of the divine that is returned to the source when you're done with it? One that follows closer to the laws of physics and the teachings of mystics. And that's a really tough order, Because really right now we're pretty busy just living and learning and loving and leaving these bodies. It is a full-time job being alive. So it's hard to think about not being alive. It's hard, even if it's trying to contemplate something eternal or not eternal. But perhaps after you've had a simple supper, you can reflect on the eternal now of a life well lived. May it be so.